Hello fellow embroiderers, Jerseydood here again. Still talking about how I digitize patches in video number 4. This time I've called in some other friends to help illustrate some of the difficulties we were speaking of last time, or I was complaining of. The problem of getting things to land where you want them, the devil of push-pull, and how it affects where things land when you actually stitch them. How do you sequence these things to make it all work out? This fellow here is the mascot, the logo for the Sarnia Sting. They are a hockey team based out of Sarnia, Ontario, which is way down on the southern tip of Lake Huron, not too far from Detroit, USA. They play in the OHL, the Ontario Hockey League, which is a major junior hockey league, basically 18 to 22-year-olds, I believe. Most of these kids are contracted to NHL teams, but they are not quite professionals yet. The branding in this level is really, really great, and this guy here exemplifies that right to the hilt. So I digitized this whole thing. I should mention that this is drawn or digitized on white background because I intended it to be on white canvas, and the areas that are white in the patch are the background fabric. I save a lot of stitching that way. There are people that prefer to have something 100% embroidered, all thread, no background fabric. Yeah, that takes an awful lot of time and thread and wear and tear on the machine. I tend to just go with the background fabric. And I've chosen a canvas that has some of the look of actual stitched embroidery. So I prefer to make that compromise. So I digitized this whole thing. There's a fair amount of unstitched area in here, which you would think, okay, that economizes on some of the push-pull. But then again, it may make it more difficult because that is open, unsupported fabric that may be distorted by all the stitching around it. So I digitized this thing, and I reasoned that all of the black areas would be in the background. Then gold and white details would be stitched on top of that. And then the last thing that would go in would be the satin stitch white border that goes around it all. And then the fabric is cut away, and I actually burn the edges with a lighter by hand, and that creates my patch. Now, this looks perfect. When I went to stitch it out, I spoke of last time of the frustration of seeing a perfectly digitized rendering come out as an absolute fail because something missed. And this is the one I was really referring to. This guy stitched out and everything was really, really gorgeous. And the last thing to stitch was the border, and it was lockstep perfect. It's very tight around the outside edge, and it got all the way around to about just outside of his right glove, and the whole area from there down around the top of the S to about here missed by more than 1/8 of an inch. There was a huge gap out here, and it just utterly ruined the entire patch, and I was so frustrated. Why would it be perfect everywhere? Why would it not be off a commensurate amount here? Why would this part of the border not have stitched right over the top of the dang stick blade? That's the confounding nature of push-pull. How did I defeat that? I changed the sequencing of the design, and I stitched the white border first, and then I filled in all the other details. in the previous order, and that managed to solve my problem. Did I get lucky, or was I really, really good? You be the judge. I will bring in another good friend that I have stitched a couple of times already, because I did 2 different versions of the jersey in different colors. I really like this fellow quite a lot. C'est le logo de Voltigeur de Drummondville. Now, for everyone other than Alexa, that means this is the logo of the Drummondville Voltigeurs. This team is from Drummondville, Quebec, sort of kind of up in the neighborhood where Alexa or Misty or whatever she calls herself lives, up in Quebec, north of Montreal. Drummondville is east and north, and Mont-Laurier is west and north, quite a bit farther. This design, I love this design. It's dynamic, it's interesting, it's funny, it's a caricature, a cartoon, but it really gives the message of the fighting man, the protector of the public good. And you can see there's a lot of dynamicism in all of this. You can see in the hat that is digitized as a digitized block, and the stitch angle rolls with the hat, and you should just see it in person. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. The sleeve in the back here is digitized block, and the stitch angle rolls with the shape of the Voltigeur's arm, and this sleeve also rolls. The stitch angles roll with the shape of this man's arm. You should see it in real life. The bright, shiny Madeira polyneon thread reflecting the light just glistens off of this and rolls across the surface as you move across the design. It's really dynamic. That, again, representing the opportunity for you to create visual interest in your designs. Now, why do I bring this guy up? Le Voltigeur. This is a stitch-intensive design. Every square inch of this entire thing is embroidered, and you would think that the push-pull would be absolutely brutal on this thing, and yet it stitched the first time absolutely perfectly, and every time I've stitched it since, absolutely perfectly. Why? How did this design succeed where others have failed? I'll tell you. The last thing to stitch on this design is the black. All of these color fields are added. They're sewn first over the background material, which in this case was black. Everything in this design was stitched first as a field of color. The last thing to stitch were the black outlines that actually define the artwork. And they are made up of many, many, many digitized block pieces. You can see this is all digitized blocks, and there are numerous pieces involved in making up this design. All of those pieces are digitized blocks, and they were ultimately branched into groupings so that certain areas would stitch as a group, depending on their depth within the graphic. the hand is on top of the sleeve and on top of the gun, which is on top of the left sleeve and shoulder, which is above the head and face. The hat is on top of the face. These various and numerous black pieces were grouped together as stitch mobs, or groups, if you will, and not all stitched at once. That I figured that was pushing the efficiency thing just a bit too far, but I stitched them in groups as they appear in depth on the image. And because of the width of much of this, they will stitch over the color fields behind them regardless of whether they're perfectly aligned or not, and in the end ultimately define the alignment of the image. This thing stitches beautifully, whereas our friend from Sarnia, who has far less stitch density than Le Voltigeur, this thing was off by a mile on the outside. This video is all about fleshing out the idea of sequencing and stitch angles and push-pull, thinking outside the box, trying to figure out how to successfully make these things stitch. This has got to be in the back of your mind as you work your way along.